It had been weeks, maybe even months, since I first noticed the way Jeff looked at me. At first, I dismissed it as nothing, just the casual, caring way an older uncle might look after his niece. But then those moments started adding up, each glance lasting just a second longer than the last, a touch lingering just a little too long. His smile became something else, a quiet promise I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge but couldn't deny. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on my shoulder the last time we were alone, the way it lingered just a touch longer than necessary before pulling away. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just an uncle looking out for me. But deep down, I knew. I knew every time he brushed past me, every time our hands would accidentally touch, my heart would skip a beat. There was something about him, his deep voice, the way his gaze would soften when he looked at me. His presence was comforting, but it stirred something inside me I couldn't control, something I wasn't ready to face. The truth was, I was drawn to him. My mind fought against it, but my body, my emotions, they didn't care. As I sat in my room that morning, staring out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. I had no idea how it would unfold, but the anticipation was thick in the air. It was as if time had slowed down, and every second I spent waiting for that moment felt like it was stretching out forever. And then it happened. He knocked on my door, and before I could even answer, he was already inside. "Faster, Jeff," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. The next few days felt like a blur. Every time I saw Jeff, my pulse quickened, and my thoughts became a storm of confusion. It wasn't like I hadn't known him before he was my uncle, after all. But this was different. Something had shifted, a connection between us that I couldn't explain. Every stolen glance, every time his hand brushed against mine, my heart raced faster than it should have. I tried to push it out of my mind, tell myself it was nothing. But the way Jeff looked at me, the subtle warmth in his eyes, left me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself that one afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, trying to distract myself with a book, when Jeff came out, holding a cup of coffee. He looked at me for a long moment, almost as if he were deciding something, before walking over and sitting beside me. His scent, woodsy and warm, wrapped around me as he settled in. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air thick with unspoken words. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, his fingers brushed lightly against mine. The contact was so brief, so innocent, but it felt like an electric current that ran up my arm and settled in my chest. I looked up at him, trying to gauge his expression, but he was already looking away, as if trying to hide his own turmoil. "You look beautiful today," he said softly, his voice like velvet, yet laced with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I felt my cheeks flush under his gaze, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if he was feeling the same pull I was. But no, that was impossible. He was my uncle, after all. I smiled awkwardly, trying to maintain control. "Thanks, Jeff," I muttered, my heart pounding in my ears. But then, without thinking, I reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear. The action so casual, but it felt like a secret only we shared. Jeff's eyes darkened slightly, and he didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned just a little closer, his breath brushing against my skin. For a split second, everything felt too close, too real. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and yet I felt myself pulling back, my mind screaming that this was wrong. "Karen," he whispered my name, his voice tight. "We can't keep doing this." But I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I was drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. The connection was there, unspoken but clear. And for that brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as wrong as I thought. As the days went by. The air between Jeff and me became thick with unspoken words, the tension between us palpable. Every time our paths crossed, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me, his gaze both tender and heavy, as if he was silently begging for something neither of us could articulate. Each touch, accidental or otherwise, sent a ripple through my entire body, leaving me breathless in ways I couldn't explain. One evening, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. The soft glow of the overhead lights cast long shadows, and the hum of the fridge was the only sound that filled the silence between us. I was reaching for a plate when Jeff stepped closer, just enough for me to feel the heat of his body near mine. His hand brushed against my lower back, a touch so light, yet it burned through my shirt. "Let me help you with that," he said quietly, his voice low and thick, like the warning before a storm. I nodded, my throat tight, my hands suddenly shaky. As Jeff reached past me to grab something from the counter, his arm brushed against mine, and my breath caught in my chest. The space between us felt smaller, too small, like we were drawn together by an invisible force neither of us could resist. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel his presence so strongly, the heat radiating from his body like a fire I wasn't sure I wanted to avoid. And then, slowly, he took my hand, just a soft, tentative touch at first. But then his fingers intertwined with mine, holding on just a little longer than necessary. His grip was firm, his touch full of longing, and I couldn't pull away. My heart raced as I looked up at him, our faces so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. His eyes flickered to my lips, then back to my eyes, as if trying to decide something. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, but instead, he slowly leaned in, his lips brushing against my forehead in a soft, lingering kiss. The warmth of his lips sent a jolt through me, a wave of heat crashing down that left me breathless. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, both of us standing on the edge of something we shouldn't cross. "I shouldn't be doing this," he whispered against my skin, his voice rough with restraint. But his body didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned closer, pressing against me, and I could feel the weight of his desire no longer hidden behind his words. I hesitated, my mind screaming that this was wrong, that I shouldn't want this. But the pull toward him was undeniable, like a magnetic force that I couldn't escape. With trembling hands, I placed one on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric. I could sense the hesitation in him, the conflict, but it didn't stop the way his fingers slowly trailed down my arm, tracing the path of my veins as if memorizing the feel of my skin. The tension between us stretched like a taut wire, and for a second, everything hung in the balance. Should I push him away? Or should I give in to the electric connection that seemed to bind us? Before I could decide, he gently pulled away, his eyes filled with conflict. "Karen," he breathed, his voice almost pleading, "I don't want to hurt you." But the desire in his eyes was clear, and my body responded before my mind could catch up. I took a small step forward, our bodies almost touching, feeling the pull between us stronger than ever. "I'm not afraid, Jeff," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I just don't know what to do anymore." The moment hung in the air, heavy with anticipation, and I could feel the weight of everything that had led up to this, every stolen glance, every lingering touch, all culminating in this single instant. Jeff's eyes searched mine, both of us standing on the precipice of something we could no longer deny. Without a word, his hand reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my skin, as if savoring the sensation. Our breaths mingled, shallow and quick, as the space between us closed. His forehead touched mine, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the world had faded away. All that existed in that moment was the warmth of his body and the unspoken desire that filled the space between us. "Karen," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his breath hot against my skin. I could feel the conflict still lingering, but there was something deeper in his gaze, now something raw, something undeniable. And then, as if the weight of it all had become too much, his lips found mine, soft at first, as if testing the waters. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I thought time itself had stopped. But then, the dam broke. The dam that had held back everything we had been too afraid to acknowledge. My hands reached up, pulling him closer, my fingers threading through his hair as if anchoring him to me. The kiss deepened, a release of all the tension we'd been holding. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a surrender, a letting go of everything we had been holding back. I could feel his hands roam along my back, tracing the lines of my spine, pulling me closer, pressing me against him, as if we could melt into each other. His body was warm and solid, and I couldn't get close enough. Every inch of him felt like home. I responded in kind, my hands exploring his chest, memorizing the feel of him, the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my fingertip. My breath hitched as his lips moved down to my neck, sending a wave of heat through me. His touch was gentle, yet there was a hunger in it that matched my own, an ache that had been building for far too long. We pulled back for just a second, our foreheads still touching, our breaths ragged. I looked into his eyes, searching for the words I couldn't find. But in that look, we understood everything, no more doubts, no more hesitation. "I need you, Jeff," I whispered, my voice barely audible, yet filled with a depth of feeling I could no longer hold back. And in that moment, there was no turning back. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came after everything had been said without words, after the weight of emotions had been shared and understood. We lay there, our bodies tangled together as the first light of dawn began to filter through the window. It was a peaceful quiet, but there was something else beneath it, a change, a shift. I ran my fingers gently over Jeff's chest, tracing the steady beat of his heart beneath the surface of his skin. The sound of it grounded me, reminding me that what we had just shared was real. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and while there was an undeniable sense of fulfillment in that, there was also a lingering question. Where did we go from here? Jeff shifted, his hand brushing my cheek as he turned to look at me. His eyes were soft, but there was something different in them now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Karen," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what this means for us, but I can't imagine going back to how things were." I nodded, my heart swelling with both fear and hope. I felt the same way, like everything had shifted, but I wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. We had both been carrying so much for so long, and now we were faced with the aftermath, the reality of what had just happened. Would we be able to navigate the complications? Or had we crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? But even as the uncertainty loomed, there was something undeniably real between us now. A bond forged in the fire of our emotions, in the heat of our desire. I didn't know where this path would lead, but in that moment, I was willing to find out. "I don't regret it," I said, my voice steady, but my heart pounding. "I don't know what happens next, but I don't regret it." Jeff smiled, his hand squeezing mine. "Neither do I." We lay there, not saying anything more, but knowing that the moment we had shared had changed us both. It was a turning point, a new chapter, and though I didn't have all the answers, I felt something stirring within me, something hopeful. Maybe this was the start of something neither of us had expected, but neither of us could walk away from as I glanced at him one last time, before I closed my eyes. I couldn't help but wonder if, despite the complications, we had finally found something real in the midst of the chaos.